The night air felt heavier than usual as I adjusted my notes, the paper trembling slightly in my hands. Every detail mattered tonight. The precise phrasing, the pause for emphasis, the cadence that could carry decades of unspoken truths to the room full of familiar faces. My heart thudded unevenly, a mixture of anticipation and the quiet fear that my words might never reach those who needed to hear them. For weeks, I had rehearsed silently in my apartment, imagining the weight of every glance, every subtle reaction, every moment that could tip the balance between silence and revelation. I wonder, have you ever tried to speak a truth so vital that even the threat of being silenced made your voice shake? Yet you knew it had to be heard no matter what. Just as I took a steadying breath, placing my hand near the microphone, a subtle click echoed across the room. I realized in that instant that my voice might be cut off before it even began. And yet, somewhere in the back of my mind, a stubborn defiance sparked. The tension in the room was palpable, the quiet before the storm of confrontation, betrayal, and revelation. The click of the microphone echoed in my ears long after it happened, a sharp punctuation that left the room suspended in awkward silence. I felt my hands grow warmer against the papers I held, the slight tremor in my fingers betraying my attempt to remain composed. That one deliberate action, a small, almost invisible motion from across the stage, had shifted the entire energy of the room. I wanted to speak, to reach the people who had come to hear me, yet the tool I had counted on for clarity had been taken away in an instant. It was a quiet betrayal, almost invisible to the casual observer, but it landed heavily on my chest like a stone I could not move. I remembered the first time I had felt silenced, though not by technology. Years ago, at a family dinner, I had tried to voice a concern about decisions that affected everyone, and I was interrupted so thoroughly that my words felt swallowed whole. That moment, buried and forgotten by others, had left an echo inside me, a persistent awareness that when I tried to claim my space, I could be shut down. Tonight felt eerily similar. The stakes were higher, the audience larger, and the weight of past silences pressed in from all sides. I shifted slightly, trying to gather my composure, and noticed the small faces in the front row, some curious, some doubtful, some just waiting for drama. My voice might have been cut, but the room still leaned in, as if sensing that something important was about to slip through. I tried to scan the crowd, to find allies, to gauge the room's energy, and realized that some people were already talking quietly among themselves. The hum of whispers became a rhythm that mirrored my own pulse. Even without sound, even with the betrayal of that microphone, something in the moment told me that the truth I carried could not be contained. I turned my focus inward, replaying the words I had prepared, memorized like a mantra. Each sentence was more than just language. It was a thread of everything I had lived through, every frustration, every unspoken disappointment, every time I had felt overlooked. My memories of late nights pacing my apartment, scribbling notes in the margins of worn notebooks, came alive. They reminded me why this mattered, why the risk of being cut off had to be met with determination. If my voice could be silenced, the ideas, the confessions, the lessons had to find another path. There was a subtle moment when I noticed the antagonist's expression. Calm, almost smug, the satisfaction of someone who believed control had been firmly seized. It was a face I had seen before in family disputes, in boardrooms, in conversations where my contributions had been minimized. That expression carried confidence but also underestimation. They did not know how far I had thought ahead. That small, underestimated confidence would soon become a miscalculation. I glanced down at my papers again. In the corner of the top page, a margin note caught my eye, a line I had almost skipped in my preparation but had decided to leave. A Chekhov's gun, I thought silently, remembering the advice I had once read. Everything placed in the story has a purpose. Tonight, this line, this note, could be more than preparation, it could be salvation. The irony that something as minor as a scribble could defy a deliberate silencing made me smile quietly to myself, though I kept my expression neutral for the audience. My mind flicked to the audience again. Some were leaning forward now, noticing the tension, sensing that a struggle was unfolding, and I realized that even silence carries weight. Words unspoken, gestures made, and subtle cues can communicate far more than a microphone. I could feel that room listening, waiting to connect dots. Even if the antagonist believed the act of cutting sound had finished me, I felt a small, stubborn spark of hope rise within me. Maybe it was naive, maybe reckless, but it reminded me that power doesn't always lie in tools. Sometimes it resides in persistence, clarity of purpose, and knowing what must be said. As I straightened my back and lifted my chin, I began to formulate a plan. I would not simply rely on sound to reach them. My hands would gesture, my eyes would hold attention, my inflections would carry meaning. My presence, my conviction would become the medium. Every moment of suppression I had endured before, every time I had been spoken over, ignored, or dismissed, all of it now funneled into a quiet, unwavering resolve. The microphone had been cut, but my voice, my story, and my dignity were still intact. I recalled a lesson from years of speaking in tense situations. Control what you can, accept what you cannot, and make every gesture matter. Even the smallest movement can communicate courage, frustration, or conviction. I spread my notes slightly on the podium, letting them fall naturally, almost carelessly, so that the audience would notice the deliberate arrangement. Each sheet became a visual testament to preparation, thoughtfulness, and hidden strength. I did not need the microphone for people to see that I had a message, that I was ready, that I would not be silenced. The whispers in the room grew louder, not in mockery, but in intrigue. They leaned forward, unsure what would come next, and I realized that the disruption had unexpectedly captured their attention. Had the microphone worked, I might have been one voice among many, but now, every gesture, glance, and fragment of words would carry extra weight. I began to sense a rhythm, an unspoken collaboration forming with the audience, each person picking up cues I had carefully embedded in my preparation. I allowed myself a brief internal laugh. The audacity of attempting to silence someone had unintended consequences. The very act that was meant to intimidate now amplified anticipation. I could almost feel the tension in the room thickening into potential energy, ready to release when the moment arrived. In that instant, I understood that power is rarely absolute. Attempts to control, to suppress, or to dominate can create cracks that let truth seep through in unexpected ways. The plan was taking shape, and with it, a quiet confidence began to replace anxiety. I did not yet know exactly how the confrontation would unfold, but I could feel it. The room had already begun to hear, even if not through the device I had depended on. My mind cycled through options, gestures, pacing, and timing, imagining each audience reaction and how I could respond without faltering. In that delicate, suspended moment, the story that had been silenced for too long was ready to assert itself, even without sound. Transition to part 2. The microphone had been cut, but my strategy was now clear. How would the audience receive a voice they could barely hear? Could subtle gestures, determined presence, and fragments of words carry the full weight of years of untold truth? The anticipation was unbearable and exhilarating at the same time, and I had to step forward, trusting that silence could still speak volumes. The tension in the room was tangible, almost physical, as I stepped slightly closer to the edge of the stage, careful to make my movements deliberate but not exaggerated. My heartbeat seemed loud enough to echo, though I doubted anyone else could hear it. Every gesture now carried meaning. I realized that with the microphone gone, I had to rely entirely on presence, eye contact, and pacing to reach the people who had gathered to listen. I couldn't allow the silence to intimidate me. It had to become a tool rather than a barrier. I recalled the countless hours I had spent preparing, practicing not only my words but also my posture, my pauses, my emphasis. I had imagined scenarios where technology might fail, though I had never truly expected it to happen. Now, standing under the stark lights, I felt a mixture of anger, disbelief, and resolve. The act of cutting the microphone had been personal, a deliberate assertion of power meant to diminish me, and I felt that weight keenly. Yet, paradoxically, it was also sharpening my focus. I noticed small details in the audience that I had overlooked before. A raised eyebrow, a hand gripping the edge of a seat, a quiet nod of encouragement from someone in the back. These subtle reactions reminded me that communication extends beyond sound. People can perceive sincerity, frustration, and determination through posture, gestures, and even the intensity of a gaze. I allowed myself a tiny, almost imperceptible smile. The microphone had been silenced, but I was far from powerless. As I began moving through the first points of my talk, I alternated between glances at the audience and fleeting memories of past betrayals. I remembered a moment at work, when a colleague had taken credit for a project I had spearheaded, leaving me with no recourse and a hollow sense of recognition lost. The pattern was familiar, someone attempting to suppress my voice intentionally or otherwise. But unlike then, I could respond. I had an advantage: preparation, clarity, and the knowledge that words carry weight even when barely audible. I adjusted my papers on the podium and began to speak, focusing on the cadence of my own internal rhythm. Each word I could manage to project seemed small, almost fragile, but the room's attention amplified them. I could feel it, listeners leaning in subconsciously, picking up on phrasing, tone, and urgency. Even silence can carry tension, and the sudden absence of amplified sound had made every nuance more noticeable. The room was listening differently now, more intently, more deliberately. The antagonist watched me with the same faint smirk, a shadow of overconfidence that I had learned to read in people who underestimate the persistence of someone they think they control. I realized that the act of cutting the microphone had not gone unnoticed by others, and their curiosity was subtly aligning with my presence. It was a strange sort of poetic justice, the way an attempt to suppress now amplified focus. I allowed a slight pause, letting the quiet stretch just long enough to create anticipation, a space where the audience would fill in meaning for my gestures and expressions. I remembered a piece of advice a mentor once gave me about moments like these. Control what you can, accept what you cannot, and let your intentions show through consistency. The microphone was gone. The sound system was beyond my influence. But the meaning, the intention, and the emotion behind my words, those were entirely within my control. I straightened my shoulders, breathed deliberately, and let the first sentences of my story unfold with measured precision. Each line became an extension of my presence, a silent assertion that I would not be diminished. My mind briefly flicked to the family conflicts that had shaped me, the subtle betrayals of relatives who thought power lay in the ability to silence rather than to listen. The energy in this room reminded me of those moments, but with a crucial difference. I was prepared, I was present, and I had learned resilience. The audience, even in their quiet, was now participating in a collective act of acknowledgement. I could sense their curiosity, their engagement, and I realized that sometimes the lack of sound sharpens perception. Every gesture, glance, and inflection became amplified in significance. I moved closer to the edge of the stage, letting my hands rest lightly on the podium, drawing invisible lines in the air as I spoke. Even without volume, I could communicate conviction through subtle emphasis. Each movement was deliberate, pointing to notes, opening palms to invite understanding, slight head tilts to underscore questions I posed silently to the audience. The energy shifted. What had been an act of control by another now became an opportunity for me to reclaim authority in a different form. The initial tension began to evolve into something almost tangible, a quiet power that pulsed through the room. I could sense minds turning toward my story, even if ears were only catching fragments. Every small expression of attention became a signal that the disruption had not destroyed my voice. It had redirected it. I began to understand that resilience is not only about being heard but about creating conditions where people listen, consciously or unconsciously, even in the absence of conventional channels. Then came a subtle movement in the back, a nod, almost imperceptible, that felt like permission to continue, like an unspoken alliance forming in the room. I leaned slightly forward, letting my eyes meet those who were paying attention, and realized that I had become a conductor of attention, orchestrating presence rather than relying on amplification. The act of cutting the microphone had given me an unexpected advantage. Everyone now had to focus to translate nonverbal cues into understanding. I had turned a limitation into a lever for connection. I allowed a flash of memory to surface, a reminder of when I had first learned to trust my own voice under pressure. The incident had been minor at the time. A small meeting, a group of colleagues laughing while my ideas went unheard, but it had instilled in me an awareness that words are sometimes best communicated through presence, patience, and precision. Those early lessons were now invaluable, informing every gesture, every pause, every glance. The audience could not ignore intention. I felt a quiet, inward triumph. The plan I had been hesitant to trust was working. Even without sound, the story was taking hold. The gestures, inflections, and careful pacing were transforming the disruption into an unexpected narrative device. I could see the effect. Subtle shifts in body language, small reactions, and absorbed attention. It was not perfect, not as direct as amplified sound, but it was potent in its own way. The tension, once threatening, had become a bridge. Every silent moment heightened awareness. Every minor adjustment in posture communicated intent, and every fragment of spoken word, carried with presence, was magnified. I realized that the act meant to diminish me had inadvertently elevated my message. My focus sharpened, my confidence strengthened, and I felt a small but steady surge of control returning. The room, unknowingly, was becoming part of the story itself. I paused once more, letting silence hang deliberately, and observed the reactions. The shift was subtle, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. Attention had turned into engagement, curiosity into participation. The microphone had been intended to control, to suppress, but instead, it had highlighted my adaptability and resilience. I could feel that I had captured their attention in a way that sound alone could not achieve. The disruption had become a catalyst for presence, focus, and connection. Transition to part 3. The initial shock of being silenced had passed, replaced by a conscious strategy. How would I maintain this fragile advantage, turning subtle gestures and partial words into a fully realized narrative? Could the audience perceive the full depth of my message despite the deliberate interruption? The tension had evolved into opportunity, but the challenge was only beginning. The room remained quiet, yet every eye seemed to follow the smallest movement I made. The absence of amplified sound had transformed the atmosphere into something almost tangible, like a heavy fabric draped over everyone present. I realized I had entered a delicate dance. My words, my gestures, my timing, all had to convey meaning in a vacuum created by someone else's deliberate interruption. There was no margin for error, no opportunity to hide behind volume or clarity. Every pause, every glance, every inflection now mattered more than ever. I noticed subtle shifts in audience engagement. Some leaned forward, fingers brushing against the edge of their seats. Others tilted their heads slightly, subconsciously attuning themselves to what I could still communicate. Even without a microphone, connection was forming, though it felt fragile. I drew in a deep breath, aware that this fragile attention could shatter with one misstep. The betrayal I had experienced by having my voice literally cut was still present, a reminder that power dynamics are often wielded in ways invisible until tested. My mind flicked back to the moments leading up to this event. The person who had cut the microphone had smirked subtly, confident in their assumption that silence equals compliance. I remembered the countless occasions in life when people assumed my silence signified weakness. That pattern of underestimation fueled my determination. I realized that control is never absolute. It shifts depending on perception and initiative. Now, more than ever, I needed to seize the initiative, even in a room where sound had been weaponized against me. I shifted my stance slightly, letting the gesture guide attention. A hand motion here, a step there, even a tilted head carried meaning. I began to internalize each word before it left my lips, allowing my body to speak when the room could not hear the words themselves clearly. I noticed small nods in response, faint but perceptible, signaling that comprehension and empathy were present. The disruption meant to silence had inadvertently amplified subtlety and intention, forcing a depth of presence I hadn't anticipated but could now wield. A memory surfaced, one of a heated family dinner where voices were raised and opinions ignored. I had sat quietly, measured in speech, feeling unseen yet observing everything. That moment had taught me the potency of patience and attentiveness. Now, standing in this silent void, I realized that those same lessons applied. The cut microphone had created a parallel. It demanded attention, not noise. I became more deliberate with pacing, letting small pauses punctuate my emphasis, inviting the audience to interpret the gravity of my statements themselves. I could sense the person responsible for the microphone cutting growing slightly restless. Perhaps they hadn't anticipated that silence would not equal defeat. I felt a surge of quiet satisfaction at this subtle reversal. Control was not solely in the hands of those who attempt to dominate through obstruction. It could be reclaimed through presence, poise, and clarity of intent. My gestures became sharper, more purposeful, conveying meaning through deliberate rhythm rather than volume. The audience's engagement deepened as I continued, small but steady signals of comprehension emerging. Some began exchanging glances, leaning slightly toward one another, as if collectively piecing together the narrative I was constructing without amplification. I realized that attention, when voluntary and active, can be far more powerful than sound alone. The moment had shifted from an obstacle to an opportunity, and I resolved to exploit this subtle advantage fully. I remembered advice from a mentor about resilience under pressure. Let external disruptions guide you, not dictate you. The act of cutting the microphone had forced me to find alternative methods of communication, ways I had not fully explored in preparation. That constraint now became a crucible for focus and ingenuity. My expressions, my timing, my stance, all became critical instruments for conveying narrative, emotion, and meaning. I could feel the audience responding, their attention turning into active engagement. For a moment, I allowed myself to consider the irony of the situation. The act intended to undermine me had now drawn the room into a shared experience of anticipation and focus. Each subtle movement, each carefully chosen word, became magnified in effect. I realized that moments of apparent suppression can become platforms for transformation. The silence that had been intended as a barrier was now a conduit for influence, as attention sharpened and perspective shifted. The tension began to evolve into an almost electric awareness. I moved closer to the audience, making eye contact deliberately with a few individuals in the front row. My words, though faint, were anchored by intent, and the audience's attention magnified them. I could feel the subtle rhythm of engagement, a pulse that coursed through gestures, glances, and breathing patterns. What had been intended as suppression now demanded deeper focus and empathy from everyone present. I recalled past experiences of being silenced, intentionally or through circumstance. Those memories fueled my composure, informing each deliberate action I took. I realized that resilience is often exercised in silence, in the moments where control is challenged. In this setting, every movement became part of a language of presence, a dialect of intent. The room was listening differently, forced into attentive observation rather than passive hearing. I allowed a reflective pause, letting the quiet stretch, feeling the weight of anticipation in the room. The disruption from the microphone had initially felt like a betrayal, a symbolic act of control, but now it had become a lens through which I could demonstrate poise, clarity, and command. I sensed that the audience was internalizing the message even more profoundly because they were active participants, interpreting meaning through context rather than being spoon-fed sound. Small, almost imperceptible reactions encouraged me further. A shift in posture, a faint lean forward, a quiet nod. These were indicators that attention had transformed into comprehension and emotional resonance. The initial act of silencing had inadvertently created conditions for deeper connection. I realized that even in adversity, there is potential for empowerment if one is willing to adapt and trust the strength of presence. As I continued, the memory of previous confrontations where my voice had been diminished flashed briefly in my mind. Each instance had shaped my understanding of authority, influence, and the subtle ways people assert control. Here, in this room, those lessons converged. The cut microphone was no longer an obstacle. It was a proving ground. My gestures, pacing, and deliberate expression were enough to convey nuance, challenge assumption, and command focus. By now, the audience's energy had subtly shifted. Curiosity was replaced with active engagement. The disruption intended to suppress my voice had, paradoxically, created a stage for deeper influence. I felt a quiet triumph, recognizing that resilience is measured not just by what one can say, but by how one adapts to what cannot be controlled. My body, my presence, and the deliberate management of attention became my instruments of authority. Transition to Part 4. The initial strategy had succeeded, but the challenge was far from over. Could I maintain this delicate balance, translating silent control into fully comprehended impact? How would the audience respond to the unfolding revelations and the tension that still lingered between intention and reception? The struggle between suppression and voice had only begun to deepen, promising moments of confrontation and discovery. The initial surge of control I had felt began to settle, replaced by a creeping awareness that this was only the beginning of a more intricate challenge. The room had absorbed my silent cues, my subtle gestures, but I knew the person responsible for cutting the microphone wasn't done. They had created a ripple, an undercurrent of tension that was now winding its way through the crowd. Every glance, every whispered reaction, held potential for disruption or insight. I realized that the act of silencing me had not just attempted to undermine my voice. It had exposed the deeper dynamics of attention, authority, and perception in ways I was only beginning to comprehend. I recalled the countless moments throughout my life when others had sought to diminish my presence through small, calculated acts. This was similar in effect, though more public, more immediate. Those earlier experiences had taught me patience, to wait for openings rather than forcing action. Now, in this charged silence, I understood that patience would again become a tool, not a weakness. I needed to read microexpressions, anticipate reactions, and maintain composure, even as the betrayal of having my microphone cut echoed in my awareness. My hands moved slightly, conveying intention without overt theatrics. I noticed some subtle shifts among the audience. A few people leaning forward, curiosity mixing with concern. Others rigid, unsure how to interpret the sudden constraints on my speech. The act that had been intended as an instrument of control had inadvertently focused the room's collective attention. I realized that limitation often amplifies perception. When sound is removed, observation becomes more acute, more attentive. I found myself channeling energy into precision, allowing each gesture, each carefully chosen word, to carry weight beyond mere sound. A memory surfaced of a classroom debate from years earlier. I had been cut off mid-sentence, ridiculed for speaking too freely, and yet those who truly listened later reflected on the points I had made. That incident, once a source of quiet shame, now served as a guide. Silence does not always equate to invisibility. The cut microphone had created a similar effect. Attention sharpened, scrutiny intensified, subtle messages amplified. I had an opportunity to transform what had been intended as suppression into a demonstration of presence and authority. I glanced at the person responsible, who was now frowning, likely realizing that their attempt to control the room had partially backfired. The tension between intention and effect fascinated me. Power often relies on expectation, and here expectation had been challenged. I understood that influence in this context would not come from volume, but from strategy, from deliberate control over rhythm, body language, and timing. Every shift of weight, every movement of the eyes, became a piece of communication, carefully calibrated to maintain engagement and assert authority. I shifted my stance, adopting a posture that projected confidence even as I remained acutely aware of the fragility of the moment. Each gesture, each carefully paced breath, contributed to a subtle narrative. I could feel the room responding differently than they would have if the microphone had been functioning. A slight nod, a tentative lean forward, an exchange of glances among audience members. These were signs that comprehension and connection were growing. The disruption had demanded presence, and in response, I discovered the room had become attuned to nuances it might have otherwise ignored. I reflected on the psychology of silence. Often, people interpret quiet as compliance, but it can also heighten sensitivity, focus attention, and provoke thought. The act of cutting my microphone had been intended to diminish me, yet it had achieved the opposite effect. I realized that the room was not just hearing me through words but absorbing meaning from context, intention, and subtle cues. It was a reminder that influence does not always require overt force. Sometimes constraint can become an instrument of amplification. A quiet frustration began to mingle with resolve. I sensed that those who had acted to silence me were beginning to underestimate the potential impact of their actions. They had assumed that removing my voice would remove authority, yet authority had shifted into other channels: gesture, eye contact, deliberate pacing, and calculated pauses. I felt a growing sense of empowerment, a recognition that resilience is often exercised through adaptation and presence rather than confrontation alone. I allowed a reflective pause, scanning the audience carefully. Some faces betrayed impatience or skepticism, but others were engaged, curious, and attentive. That delicate balance of reactions mirrored experiences from earlier confrontations in life, moments when authority and perception intersected in unpredictable ways. I realized that by observing the audience, interpreting reactions, and adjusting without overtly reacting to the sabotage, I could transform the situation from disruption into opportunity. Subtle humor crept into my awareness as well. The irony of the microphone cut, a tool intended to reduce impact, now highlighted the ingenuity of adaptation. I recalled past experiences where limitation had sparked creativity and resourcefulness, and I allowed myself a quiet acknowledgement that this was one of those moments. The act that could have been humiliating became a test of composure, presence, and subtle influence. The audience's reactions continued to shift, signaling that comprehension and engagement were increasing. My mind worked strategically, anticipating the next move, the next potential interference. The dynamics of power had changed. No longer was the disruption an obstacle to overcome. It had become a lens through which I could command attention, shape perception, and assert authority without relying on conventional amplification. I drew on inner calm to manage the tension, maintaining deliberate pacing in gestures and expressions. The subtlety of nonverbal communication now carried profound significance. Even small movements, a tilt of the head, a nod, a shift in stance, contributed to a growing sense of clarity and comprehension in the room. The act intended as suppression had become an inadvertent amplifier, highlighting resilience, focus, and control in the face of deliberate interference. Reflection continued to guide my approach. I recalled times when being silenced or underestimated had pushed me to find new methods of expression. Each instance had taught lessons in patience, observation, and adaptation. Here, in this charged room, those lessons converged. The cut microphone had created constraints that forced ingenuity, attention, and subtle authority. Every movement, glance, and pause became a tool for communicating intention and reclaiming control. By the end of the segment, I could sense that the room had shifted in energy. Curiosity and attentiveness had replaced initial uncertainty. The disruption had inadvertently produced a heightened awareness, engagement, and readiness to absorb meaning in ways that might not have been possible with sound alone. The challenge had evolved into a proving ground for resilience, composure, and strategic influence. Transition to Part 5. The battle between suppression and voice had intensified. The subtle war of attention and authority would continue to unfold. Could I maintain this delicate equilibrium and fully translate silent control into comprehension, trust, and eventual triumph? The stage was set for deeper confrontation, revelation, and the emergence of unexpected alliances. Even as the room absorbed the charged silence, I could feel the subtle undercurrents of doubt and curiosity swirling in the audience. Cutting the microphone had been an act of control, yet it had only sharpened everyone's attention. I realized then that the real challenge was not simply regaining my voice. It was asserting authority in a space where words had temporarily lost their power. Each gesture, each small motion, became a deliberate message, a replacement for the words I could not speak. I felt a heightened responsibility to translate intention into action, to communicate through presence, timing, and subtle expression. I remembered a similar moment years ago during a family meeting. I had been ignored, interrupted repeatedly, dismissed without explanation. At the time, it had felt crushing, almost unbearable. Yet that experience had taught me how to project influence without confrontation, how to read expressions, anticipate reactions, and respond in ways that commanded attention quietly but effectively. Now, standing in the same kind of charged silence, I saw that those lessons would be invaluable. The disruption was a challenge, yes, but also an opportunity to assert subtle authority and demonstrate resilience. My gaze moved across the room, noting small but significant details. A hand hovering near the chin, an eyebrow raised slightly, the shifting weight of someone leaning forward. All of these were clues to engagement or skepticism. In the absence of spoken words, observation became the most important form of communication. I realized that every motion could become a tool, a way to maintain focus, project confidence, and convey meaning. The act of cutting the microphone had inadvertently transformed the environment into a laboratory of attention, where silence amplified every nuance. I felt a surge of clarity as I reflected on what the sabotage had really meant. It was not simply about control over volume. It was about attempting to disrupt perception, to manipulate the dynamics of power subtly. But perception could not be fully dictated. By adapting my behavior and amplifying nonverbal signals, I could guide the room's interpretation, turning a potential setback into a demonstration of presence. I understood that influence in moments like these relies more on control over self than control over others. A memory of an old mentor surfaced, a quiet lesson delivered during a tense discussion. Sometimes the most effective way to lead is not to speak loudly, but to make others lean in. I felt that lesson resonating now. The cut microphone forced me to rely on subtlety, to cultivate an invisible yet tangible presence. Every glance, every controlled movement, became an instrument of communication. I felt empowered, even exhilarated, as I realized that the disruption had created conditions where skill and composure mattered far more than volume. I noticed a few faces in the audience shifting uncomfortably, likely realizing the intended effect of suppression had not worked as planned. The irony was not lost on me. The act designed to silence had illuminated my control in unexpected ways. Attention was no longer distracted by sound. It had been funneled into observation, interpretation, and anticipation. I was not just present physically. I was present perceptually, emotionally, strategically. The silence had become a lens, sharpening understanding and connection. Yet with that empowerment came tension. I could sense that the person responsible was frustrated, possibly reevaluating their plan. That anticipation, the unknown next move, kept my focus taut. I could not afford complacency. Every micro-expression, every shift in posture or gaze, became a potential signal, an early warning of disruption or alignment. I felt like a conductor orchestrating an unseen symphony, where subtlety was paramount and the stakes higher than anyone realized. I reflected on my own instinct to react vocally, to assert control through speech. That instinct had been thwarted, and I realized how much reliance on conventional methods had limited me in the past. In this silence, I discovered a new form of expression, one built on observation, deliberate pacing, and strategic visibility. The room's attention had become a resource to be managed, rather than a given. Every moment of quiet held potential, and every gesture carried influence far beyond words. A few audience members began to respond, not with verbal cues but with acknowledgement. A nod, a subtle lean forward, a quick exchange of glances. I could feel the shift in energy, the balance moving from tension to cautious engagement. It was subtle but unmistakable. The disruption had become a proving ground, where composure, patience, and strategic observation were the measures of success. I realized that influence often grows quietly, in spaces where sound is absent but attention is heightened. I also began to notice the cracks in the person's attempt to assert dominance. The act of cutting the microphone, intended to control, had actually revealed insecurities and misjudgments. Each reaction, each misstep on their part, provided insight into motivations, limitations, and potential openings. It was a reminder that attempts at suppression often expose more than they conceal, offering clues for maneuvering and subtle assertion. By now, I was fully immersed in the rhythm of the room, sensing the dynamics shifting with every movement. There was tension, yes, but also opportunity, a delicate interplay of anticipation, reaction, and adaptation. I felt that the silence, once a threat, had become a stage for demonstrating resilience, composure, and authority without relying on conventional speech. Every eye contact, every measured pause became a vector for meaning. The challenge had also sparked a deeper reflection. I thought about all the times in my life when my voice had been muted, ignored, or dismissed. Each instance had felt isolating, frustrating, and disempowering. Yet those experiences had cultivated skills I was now relying on: patience, observation, subtlety, and adaptability. What had once seemed like disadvantage was now a source of strength. The cut microphone had revealed a truth. Resilience often manifests most powerfully when conventional tools fail. Transition to Part 6. The room had shifted, attention focused and fragile, the dynamics of authority recalibrated by silence and subtlety. What began as an act of sabotage was evolving into a demonstration of influence and strategy. But the tension was far from resolved. The next stage would test not only composure but the ability to anticipate and counter deliberate interference. The battle between control and suppression was entering a deeper, more intricate phase. The subtle shift in the room's energy was unmistakable, yet I could sense a lingering unease beneath the surface. The cut microphone had temporarily silenced me, but now attention had been redirected in ways I had not anticipated. Each person's posture, each quiet glance, became a channel for unspoken communication. I realized that influence could be exerted without sound, but it demanded vigilance, awareness, and strategic patience. The tension had not disappeared, it had merely transformed, becoming a test of perception and emotional control. I recalled the last time I had faced a situation where my words were deliberately suppressed. Back then, my response had been immediate, almost instinctive, and had only escalated the tension. Now, the experience had taught me restraint. I understood that every move carried meaning, and in this charged silence, my body language, timing, and gaze would speak louder than any voice could. The disruption had forced me to discover an unspoken rhythm, to orchestrate attention with intention rather than volume. A few people in the audience were clearly unsettled, though their reactions varied. Some leaned forward, as if drawn by curiosity, while others shifted back, perhaps wary of involvement or conflict. The room had become a delicate ecosystem of anticipation and hesitation. I realized that navigating this space required not only patience but empathy, the ability to sense emotional undercurrents and respond with nuance. Every subtle cue provided insight into their perceptions, expectations, and possible reactions. I remembered a lesson from a negotiation workshop years ago. The instructor emphasized the power of presence over speech. When words fail or are blocked, it is composure, awareness, and confidence that command respect. I had never appreciated the depth of this lesson until now. With the microphone cut, I was forced to apply these principles in real time, translating them into gestures, pacing, and deliberate pauses. The disruption had become a crucible, testing not only skill but emotional fortitude. The person responsible for cutting the microphone had expected disarray, but I could sense frustration building. Their attempt to control the narrative was unraveling, not because of confrontation, but because silence had revealed an unexpected dimension of influence. I felt a subtle thrill, proof that resilience often emerges most strongly when conventional means are removed. The room's focus had shifted from domination to observation, and I was quietly steering the energy toward engagement rather than chaos. Memory flickered to an earlier family gathering where similar tensions had played out. I had been dismissed repeatedly, undermined without acknowledgement. At that time, I had felt powerless, overwhelmed by the frustration of being unheard. That experience, however painful, had taught me how to project confidence subtly, to command attention through poise and timing. The current situation mirrored that dynamic, and I could feel the continuity of lessons learned, applied with deliberate care to maintain control over perception. I noticed small but telling reactions from certain audience members. A nod, a slight lean forward, a subtle exchange of looks. Each of these cues confirmed that engagement was not dependent on volume but on presence. The absence of sound magnified every micro-expression, every tiny adjustment, creating a heightened sense of awareness. I realized that the disruption had inadvertently created conditions for more focused observation, where the nuances of human behavior became the true medium of communication. At the same time, the person who cut the microphone was clearly calculating next steps. I could feel the tension between their expectation of confusion and the reality of measured composure. Every subtle reaction I projected was now a form of resistance, a demonstration of quiet authority. The challenge had evolved beyond speaking. It had become an exercise in guiding perception, commanding attention, and asserting influence through intent rather than volume. The room had settled into a rhythm, but the underlying stakes remained. I was not merely navigating silence. I was orchestrating a response to deliberate interference. Every shift, glance, or movement became a negotiation of attention and control. I could sense that the audience, though engaged, was still measuring, weighing, and anticipating. The disruption had become a canvas for strategic expression, where each subtle act carried weight far beyond what sound could convey. Reflecting further, I realized that the cut microphone symbolized more than just a momentary obstruction. It represented attempts to suppress, to manipulate, and to challenge authority. Yet the response, my composure, strategic observation, and adaptability, demonstrated that resilience is often measured in silent strength. Power need not be loud. It can manifest quietly, steadily, and with precision, guiding the room without confrontation. I caught sight of the person responsible, watching their body language intently. There was tension, perhaps surprise, in their posture. They had not anticipated that a simple act of sabotage could backfire so profoundly, turning into a demonstration of control rather than chaos. I felt a quiet satisfaction, tempered by awareness that the situation was still unfolding. Influence is never static, and each moment brought new possibilities, requiring constant vigilance and adaptability. A quiet reflection struck me. Moments of disruption, betrayal, or obstruction often reveal hidden capacities. I had discovered a method of asserting presence without voice, shaping perception through careful observation and deliberate movement. The challenge had become a proving ground, not just for skill but for character and composure. The room's attention was now a resource, and I was learning to wield it effectively, navigating tension with insight rather than force. Transition to Part 7. The dynamics had shifted subtly but irrevocably. Silence had become a medium of influence, observation a tool for control, and resilience a quiet, visible force. Yet the tension was far from resolved, and the next stage would test not only composure but the ability to anticipate deliberate interference and respond strategically. The unfolding scenario promised deeper confrontation, revelation, and insight into both the audience and the person who had attempted to suppress me. The air felt heavier now, each heartbeat amplified by the lingering uncertainty. The earlier disruption, the cut microphone, was no longer a simple act of sabotage. It had transformed into a challenge I needed to navigate with care. I found myself scanning the room with heightened awareness, noting the subtle shifts in posture, the brief exchange of glances, and the way certain people held their breath at moments of tension. Each movement carried meaning, each silence a signal. The room had become a complex map of influence, and I was learning to read it with patience. I remembered the first time I truly understood how powerful observation could be. Years ago, during a tense family confrontation, words had failed me repeatedly. It was not until I noticed the smallest details, the twitch of an eye, the tightening of a jaw, that I could anticipate reactions and steer the interaction. That memory resurfaced now, guiding me through the current chaos. Without a microphone, my words were blocked, but my awareness could speak volumes. Every gesture, every pause, every subtle shift could communicate more than speech ever could. The person who had cut the microphone clearly expected disarray, a flustered and fragmented performance. Instead, The situation revealed a different kind of authority. Quiet, deliberate, and composed. I could sense their frustration mounting, though they maintained a mask of control. There was a peculiar satisfaction in that, a realization that attempts to undermine can sometimes reveal strengths hidden beneath expectation. Resilience, I had learned, often shows its face in moments of adversity, when conventional tools are stripped away, leaving only presence and intention. Looking around, I noticed the audience's reactions evolving. Some leaned in with curiosity, captivated by the tension and the silent dialogue unfolding. Others remained cautious, uncertain about how to interpret the nonverbal exchange. It struck me that influence is often a matter of perception, that control does not always require volume, and that silence can amplify authority when wielded thoughtfully. The disruption had created an unexpected environment of engagement, where focus shifted from words to presence, and attention became a currency of its own. I found myself reflecting on previous confrontations where being unheard had been frustrating, almost humiliating. There had been times when I had spoken, shouted even, yet the message was drowned by noise or ignored entirely. Those moments had been formative, teaching me that power could be subtle, that influence could be asserted without aggression. The current scenario was a live application of that principle, a test of how presence, awareness, and measured action could overcome attempts at suppression. As the tension stretched, I noticed microshifts from the person responsible for the interference. A subtle tightening of the jaw, a flicker of impatience in their eyes, and an almost imperceptible repositioning of posture. They were trying to anticipate my next move, to regain control over a scenario they had initially sought to dominate. Yet the silent resistance had given me an unexpected edge. The room was now attuned to my reactions rather than theirs, a subtle reversal of expectation that offered insight and, strangely, satisfaction. The dynamics reminded me of a chess game played in real time, where each piece represents perception, each pause is a strategic move, and every reaction can shift advantage. I realized that influence need not be linear. It can ripple silently through attention, shaping behavior without confrontation. The room, initially a source of potential chaos, had become a stage for subtle strategy, where gestures, glances, and timing carried as much weight as spoken words. I began experimenting with small, deliberate gestures, slight shifts in stance, measured eye contact, a purposeful pause that drew attention without breaking composure. Each act seemed to guide perception, coaxing engagement while maintaining control. The silence imposed by the cut microphone had forced me to discover a new language, one built on presence, awareness, and timing. It was a language of influence that demanded patience, observation, and emotional intelligence, revealing dimensions of resilience I had not previously recognized. A quiet revelation struck me. Disruption often provides opportunity. While the act had been intended to disempower, it inadvertently created a platform for growth, for mastery of nonverbal authority. I could sense the subtle recalibration in the room, the audience adjusting, the instigator recalculating, and myself navigating with renewed confidence. What had begun as a betrayal now presented a proving ground, a test of composure, strategy, and insight into human behavior. Even the small, overlooked reactions held meaning. A brief nod from one person, a sideways glance from another, a barely perceptible exhale of relief. All signaled that influence could be communicated quietly and effectively. I felt a mixture of humility and triumph, aware that these lessons were being learned in real time, under pressure, and in front of witnesses whose perception mattered deeply. The tension remained unresolved, but the narrative had shifted. Where disruption had initially threatened to silence, it now highlighted my ability to adapt, observe, and lead subtly. I recognized that authority is not a matter of force alone. It is cultivated through awareness, patience, and strategic engagement. The room had become an arena for testing these qualities, a place where influence could be asserted without volume, confrontation, or aggression. Transition to Part 8. The subtle contest of perception and influence had only begun to unfold. While the immediate disruption had been mitigated, deeper challenges lay ahead. The room, now attuned to every nuance, would reveal hidden allegiances, unexpected reactions, and opportunities to assert quiet control. The next stage promised revelation, strategic maneuvering, and an exploration of how resilience can transform disruption into authority. The silence in the room had settled into a strange rhythm, one that carried more tension than the chatter had ever done. Every subtle movement seemed amplified, and every glance between people suggested alliances, judgments, and hidden agendas. The cut microphone had created a vacuum of authority, and now, without the usual tools of voice or amplification, I had to rely on the only things left: observation and instinct. I felt the weight of eyes tracing every small motion, evaluating, interpreting, and sometimes doubting. I realized quickly that influence could be exerted quietly, almost invisibly, if one knew how to read the room. I recalled a similar situation from years earlier when a small disruption had taught me more than a lifetime of ordinary conversations. Back then, an unexpected silence during an important presentation had seemed like a disaster. I had been flustered, fumbling for words, and the audience had sensed hesitation. Yet over time, I had learned that attention is often more valuable than volume, and that control could be asserted subtly through timing, movement, and deliberate focus. The memory became a guidepost now. I would not speak loudly, but I would still communicate everything I needed to. As I scanned the room, I noticed subtle shifts in the instigator's posture. A hand resting a little too rigidly on the table, a foot tapping just below the visible frame, a flicker of tension across the jawline. They were still trying to control the situation, still expecting me to crumble under the forced silence. But I had begun to see these attempts as predictable, almost ritualistic, and it gave me a strange sense of calm. The disruption they had created was no longer frightening. It had become a landscape I could navigate with precision. I moved deliberately, choosing small gestures that were almost imperceptible, yet carried meaning. A tilt of the head, a measured pause before glancing around, a slow adjustment of posture. Each act subtly drew attention, signaling confidence and awareness without breaking the imposed silence. The room responded. Some leaned in, curious, eager to catch the next motion. Others hesitated, unsure how to interpret the quiet exchange. And the person who had cut the microphone, their calculated effort to silence me, began to show cracks. Subtle, almost invisible cracks, but unmistakable to anyone paying attention. It occurred to me then that the situation mirrored patterns I had witnessed countless times in other areas of life. Attempts to dominate often fail when the target refuses to react predictably. By staying calm, measured, and observant, I was already reclaiming authority, even without words. The room had become a mirror, reflecting not my fear, but my composure. And composure, I realized, is often far louder than any spoken argument. A memory surfaced unexpectedly, one that connected past and present. Years ago, I had been in a family meeting where silence had been weaponized. Words had been cut off, voices dismissed, and for a moment, I had felt powerless. But the lesson remained. When others attempt to control through disruption, it is possible to regain agency by embracing observation, timing, and deliberate engagement. Those lessons, once theoretical, were now in action. I felt the subtle thrill of strategy, the quiet satisfaction of reclaiming control without confrontation. The audience was now fully engaged in the silent contest. Their attention, previously scattered, had narrowed. Every movement I made, every glance I shared, seemed amplified. I could feel their curiosity sharpening, their expectations recalibrating. And the instigator, noticing this shift, was beginning to lose confidence. They expected disorder, but instead, I had turned disruption into subtle authority. I began to wonder, with a mix of apprehension and excitement, how far this invisible contest could extend before it demanded a different kind of engagement. My thoughts drifted to the larger patterns of influence and conflict. Often, the ones who attempt to silence others underestimate the quiet power of observation, patience, and strategic presence. In this moment, it was clear that the room itself had become a stage, one where subtle cues mattered more than volume, and where presence could command attention more effectively than words ever could. The dynamics had shifted completely, transforming potential chaos into a controlled field of interaction. Despite the composure I maintained, an undercurrent of tension persisted. The cut microphone had been a calculated move, and I knew that further disruptions were possible. The anticipation of what might come next sharpened my senses. Every slight movement, every whispered gesture, became a potential signal, a clue to unravel the intentions of others. I felt a quiet readiness settling over me, a sense that this silent contest was only just beginning, and that mastery would require not just observation, but patience, strategy, and emotional resilience. The room's energy, previously chaotic, now pulsed with unspoken communication. I realized that influence, when spoken words are denied, can take forms that are more enduring and subtle. A measured pause, a deliberate glance, a confident stance. All these elements began to carry as much weight as any speech. And in this realization, I found a strange clarity. Disruption does not have to weaken. It can reveal hidden strengths and sharpen the ability to command attention without relying on conventional tools. Transition to Part 9. The silent dynamics of the room had revealed new layers of influence, but the challenge was far from over. The instigator's next move could change everything, and hidden alliances among the audience might emerge unexpectedly. I knew that to maintain control, I would need to anticipate these shifts, remain patient, and leverage the quiet authority I had begun to assert. The next phase would test both strategy and resilience, revealing the deeper stakes of this silent confrontation. The tension in the room had settled into something fragile, almost deceptive. Everyone seemed to be waiting for the next move, though no one could say exactly who would act first. The silence, a consequence of the cut microphone, had transformed the atmosphere from chaos to a taut, expectant stillness. I could feel eyes darting between one another, measuring reactions, calculating risks. The instigator, who had cut my microphone earlier, seemed increasingly unsettled, as if the very act meant to dominate had begun to backfire. I reminded myself that influence often works best under pressure. Even when others try to disrupt, subtle shifts in posture, timing, or gaze can communicate authority more powerfully than volume ever could. I had learned that lesson in past confrontations, but now, with the entire room observing, it took on a sharper, more immediate significance. I noticed small details. A chair slightly angled, a hand brushing nervously over a notebook, a faint hesitation before someone responded to a glance. These were all signs of shifting dynamics. A memory came unbidden, a lesson from an early career meeting where my own voice had been suppressed. I had felt powerless then, caught off guard by someone else's deliberate control. Yet over time, I realized that disruption need not paralyze, it can illuminate opportunities. I could remain silent and still project control. Observing carefully, I identified patterns. Who tended to dominate conversation, who hesitated, who deferred to others. This mental mapping allowed me to anticipate the room's movements even before they happened. I began to adjust my strategy subtly. Every glance, every deliberate pause, every measured shift in position was intentional. I was no longer reacting. I was orchestrating a quiet influence. The room responded almost instinctively. Some leaned forward, drawn to the tension. Others seemed wary, uncertain how to interpret the silent power dynamic unfolding before them. The instigator's earlier confidence was eroding, and I could sense the anxiety growing beneath their carefully maintained composure. A flash of insight struck me. The microphone, once thought essential, had become irrelevant. Presence, awareness, and deliberate interaction were far more effective in shaping perception. I realized that control was less about speaking and more about commanding attention, subtly guiding interpretation, and exploiting anticipation. Every small movement I made became a signal, every measured pause a tool, and the room absorbed it all unconsciously. I remembered my own doubts at the start of the event. Fear of public embarrassment, frustration at being silenced, uncertainty about how others would react. Yet here, in the midst of disruption, I felt a quiet empowerment take root. The room had become a testing ground, a place where resilience, observation, and strategy mattered more than volume or overt assertion. I was discovering, in real time, how disruption could be transformed into a platform for unexpected authority. The instigator tried another subtle move, leaning in, attempting to catch my attention with a pointed glance, but it felt clumsy now, ineffective against the calm I had cultivated. Their attempt to provoke a reaction went unnoticed, and the audience sensed it. The shift in energy was palpable. Those who had initially hesitated now seemed to regard me differently, their own reactions moderated by the silent contest unfolding in the space between us. I realized then that influence was contagious. Once asserted with quiet confidence, it encouraged others to respond in kind. As the room adjusted to the new dynamic, I found myself reflecting on the broader implications. How often do we allow others to define the boundaries of expression through disruption? How often do we wait for permission to speak, rather than asserting presence even when silenced? In that moment, I understood that resilience is not just enduring disruption, but transforming it into leverage. I could not control the microphone, but I could control perception, timing, and the subtle dance of attention. Every subtle interaction began to feel like a dialogue in code. A raised eyebrow, a measured pause, a slow turn of the head, each conveyed intention, confidence, and awareness. I realized that the audience, previously scattered in focus, had now become aligned with the rhythm I had established. They were engaged, attentive, and quietly responsive, drawn into the narrative unfolding silently before them. The instigator, sensing this alignment, began to falter further, their earlier strategy collapsing under the weight of unexpected composure. The anticipation of what would happen next became a tangible presence. Every shift, every small movement, suggested possibilities yet unrealized. I felt the pressure of expectation, but it was now a tool rather than a threat. I could manipulate timing, read cues, and steer attention without ever raising my voice. The disruption that had seemed like a setback had become the crucible in which my resilience and strategic awareness were forged. Transition to Part 10. The room had begun to reflect a new hierarchy, invisible yet unmistakable. The instigator's confidence was waning, alliances were subtly shifting, and my silent control was consolidating. But I knew the challenge was far from over. Hidden motives, unexpected interventions, and unspoken tensions could still emerge. The next phase would require not only observation and strategy, but also decisive action to solidify the authority I had begun to assert in the midst of chaos. The room was charged, though nothing had been said for several moments. Silence, once oppressive, had begun to feel like a stage upon which every movement, glance, and breath carried meaning. I could sense the subtle shifts, the recalibration of energy around me, as if the room itself were trying to decide what role each person would play. The instigator, who had cut my microphone, was now visibly restless. Their eyes darted across the room, seeking validation, support, or perhaps a hint of fear. None came. I realized in that instant that the disruption had exposed vulnerabilities not just in me, but in everyone present. The cut microphone, intended to dominate, had forced a recalibration. People were observing, waiting to see how I would respond. Every gesture, every small decision, became amplified in significance. I remembered earlier moments in my career, when silence had felt like confinement rather than liberation. Now, silence was my instrument, and observation my amplifier. As I adjusted to this new dynamic, I noticed subtle alliances forming. Those who had been tentative now leaned toward me, their body language suggesting trust, curiosity, or quiet support. Others clung to old patterns, hesitant to embrace the unspoken shift of power. It was a delicate balance. The instigator attempted another intervention, a subtle interruption, a raised hand, an almost imperceptible tilt of the head meant to reclaim control, but it felt increasingly futile. I remained still, letting their motions speak louder than words, and the room absorbed the tension silently. I found myself reflecting on the paradox of authority. It is rarely about overt domination, and often about perception, timing, and perception of composure. In this silent theater, I had authority not because I commanded words, but because I controlled attention and focus. The audience, aware of the earlier disruption, now leaned subtly into the narrative I was crafting. Each small gesture, measuring a pause, adjusting posture, maintaining calm, reinforced the new hierarchy without a single spoken sentence. Memories of past betrayals surfaced. The times when someone tried to silence me, dismiss my presence, or undermine my credibility. Those moments had left scars, yet they had also honed a particular skill: the ability to read people, anticipate reactions, and convert disruption into leverage. I recognized that skill now as my primary advantage. I did not need a microphone to project authority. I only needed to move thoughtfully, observe keenly, and respond strategically. The room's attention became a tangible weight. Every subtle shift, every glance exchanged, began to carry multiple layers of meaning. I noticed the micro-expressions, the tightening of a jaw, a fleeting smirk, a barely noticeable shift in stance, that hinted at loyalty, hesitation, or dissent. Understanding these nuances allowed me to anticipate moves before they were made. I felt like a conductor orchestrating an invisible symphony, guiding the flow of energy and attention with minute adjustments rather than overt commands. The instigator's earlier confidence had cracked, revealing small fissures of doubt. Their previous gestures, meant to assert control, now appeared reactive, almost desperate. Meanwhile, those who had observed quietly began to mirror my composure. Authority, I realized, could be contagious. Presence and patience became more influential than volume or assertiveness. I had effectively turned the attempted sabotage into a demonstration of control, and the room, consciously or not, recognized it. A new tension emerged. Who would challenge next? I sensed someone poised on the edge of speaking, testing boundaries, measuring my reaction. The knowledge that others were quietly testing the limits added a layer of suspense, but also a sense of opportunity. I could now influence not just the instigator but the wider audience. Their uncertainty was an asset, a space in which I could maneuver strategically. The next move, I knew, would define the narrative for the remainder of the event. I drew on a deep reserve of patience, a skill honed over years of observation and reflection. Every small action became intentional. A tilt of the head, a deliberate pause, a controlled gesture, all were calculated to project control without words. The room responded subtly but unmistakably. Attention shifted, alliances solidified, and the instigator's influence waned further. I felt a quiet satisfaction, the kind that comes not from overt triumph, but from understanding that disruption can be transformed into opportunity. Transition to Part 11. The dynamics in the room had shifted dramatically, but I knew the deeper challenge was yet to come. The instigator was not finished, and others still held hidden motives. The silence that had once been my tool was now a tension-laden canvas, ready to be tested. In the next stage, I would need to combine patience, observation, and decisive intervention to maintain and extend the authority I had begun to establish. The outcome was still uncertain, but I had learned that even silence could speak volumes when wielded strategically. Even after establishing some control, a lingering tension clung to the room. The instigator's glare remained, sharp yet calculated. As though they were plotting a comeback, I could almost feel beneath the surface. I knew this was only the first ripple in a deeper undercurrent. People were no longer just passive observers. Some were quietly judging, anticipating the next move, ready to exploit even the smallest sign of weakness. That realization made my pulse quicken, not with fear, but with the awareness that authority, once challenged, required constant vigilance. I remembered moments earlier, during the silent standoff, when a subtle shift in posture or a flicker of an eye could reveal intentions. I had learned to read these small signs over the years, noticing micro-expressions that others often overlooked. Each person in the room now carried unspoken motives. Some sought reassurance, others validation, and a few tested boundaries quietly, hoping for the disruption to return in their favor. Understanding this delicate landscape was crucial. It wasn't enough to react. It demanded preemptive observation and measured response. The instigator made a subtle motion, leaning slightly forward, almost imperceptible, but enough to signal their next attempt at dominance. I chose to remain motionless, letting the room absorb the shift without granting it power. Every eye followed, and for a fleeting moment, silence became a weapon in itself. My mind traced the patterns of the room, recalling previous confrontations, recalling the times when silence had exposed truths more effectively than any words ever could. The irony was sharp. The microphone, now inactive, had failed to silence the impact of observation and perception. I noticed a few individuals glancing at one another, a quiet communication that suggested alignment or dissent. These micro-alliances had always existed, yet now they became more visible under the strain of the disruption. Each pair of eyes, each slight nod, represented potential support or subtle sabotage. I reminded myself that influence was often indirect. I didn't need to control voices. I needed to guide attention, to channel reactions in a way that reinforced the new dynamics without overt confrontation. A thought struck me about the fragility of authority. It is rarely about dominance alone. It's about timing, patience, and the perception of calm in the midst of potential chaos. The instigator's previous act of sabotage had been bold, but it also exposed them to scrutiny. Now, their every gesture could be read and reframed, while my silence gave me room to maneuver strategically. I could let their desperation reveal weaknesses while maintaining composure that signaled confidence and control. Moments stretched into an almost imperceptible rhythm, a quiet dance of attention and perception. I observed the subtle responses of the room. Shifts in posture, tightening of shoulders, the way hands rested on tables or laps. Each motion was a silent sentence, communicating allegiance, skepticism, or curiosity. My own movements were deliberate, calculated to project authority without intrusion. It was a different kind of performance, not of words, but of presence, a careful calibration of stillness and motion. Then, unexpectedly, someone from the audience broke the silence. Not with confrontation, but with a question that carried subtle judgment. It was measured, not overtly challenging, yet its undertone implied scrutiny. The room's attention shifted, and I recognized this moment as another test of influence. My response had to be equally measured, acknowledging the challenge without overcommitting, without betraying vulnerability. I chose a calm, deliberate gesture, a small tilt of the head and a composed gaze, signaling recognition and controlled engagement. The effect was immediate. The questioner hesitated, caught between probing further or yielding to the unspoken authority that now defined the space. Reflections of past encounters surfaced, lessons about patience and timing. I recalled the times when reacting too quickly had revealed insecurity, and the times when silence had forced the truth to surface. I realized that this was no different. The instigator and the subtle challengers were testing limits, and my task was to maintain balance, ensuring that authority was perceived even when the microphone had failed. Presence, observation, and strategic patience became the core tools in this silent battle of influence. A subtle shift occurred. The instigator's earlier confidence now wavered, replaced by microsigns of doubt. Yet they were not defeated. Their energy was redirected, more cautious, and I sensed that the next phase would require deliberate action. Those who had been passive observers were now leaning closer, more attentive, curious to see how the dynamics would evolve. I had turned disruption into an instrument of insight, yet I knew this equilibrium was delicate and could tip at any moment. Vigilance remained essential. The air, thick with anticipation, held unspoken questions. Who would act next? Who would rise to fill the gaps left by hesitation? I felt the weight of potential outcomes, the possibility of confrontation, revelation, or unexpected alignment. The room had transformed from a passive audience into an intricate web of intentions and influence, each node sensitive to subtle cues. My role was clear: guide, observe, and respond with patience, letting the room's reactions shape the narrative without surrendering control. Transition to Part 12. The next stage promised deeper conflict. The instigator, though cautious, was planning their next maneuver, and others in the room carried hidden agendas that had yet to surface. I realized that my calm presence alone would not be enough to maintain authority. Action, thoughtful, deliberate, and strategic, would be necessary to solidify influence and ensure that the disruption became a turning point rather than a recurring threat. The challenge was far from over, and the next moves would determine the outcome of this silent struggle. The room held its breath, a suspended moment where anticipation mingled with unease. Every pair of eyes now seemed sharper, more focused, as if waiting for the next ripple in the tension. I could sense the instigator's presence like a taut wire, ready to snap. The earlier disruption, the cut microphone, had left an indelible mark, but I had learned that momentum could be shifted quietly, deliberately, without confrontation. The real challenge now was translating observation into action, turning the subtle advantage into something tangible. I began to notice the micro-movements of the room's occupants, each telling a story of intent and expectation. Someone tapped a finger against a notebook, a faint signal of impatience. Another leaned forward, curiosity laced with skepticism. These small cues revealed more than any conversation ever could. I understood that influence wasn't about commanding attention, it was about channeling it, guiding reactions without force. The instigator's earlier confidence was now tempered by caution, but their energy still radiated subtly, testing boundaries in ways that required constant vigilance. Reflecting on previous confrontations, I realized that the disruption had created a unique opportunity. When the microphone had been silenced, people had begun listening differently, paying attention to what wasn't said, to gestures and expressions rather than spoken words. Authority had shifted quietly, from the overt speaker to the observer who understood nuance. I became hyper-aware of every shift in posture, every sideways glance, and every slight hesitation. Each was a thread I could weave into the larger narrative of control and perception. The instigator, sensing their diminished influence, started to probe subtly, introducing questions and half-statements designed to elicit reactions. I recognized the pattern immediately. It was a test, one that required patience and careful navigation. I resisted the instinct to answer too quickly, allowing silence to amplify the weight of their words. The room responded, its attention drawn naturally to the gap between challenge and response, amplifying the stakes without me needing to assert myself verbally. Observation became a form of authority, and the disruption had created the perfect stage for it. Moments stretched into a careful rhythm. I remembered an earlier lesson about restraint. The times when action had come too quickly had revealed vulnerability, while the measured pause had often forced truths to surface. Now each breath, each subtle adjustment of posture, carried meaning. The room had become a living organism, reacting to micro-influences, and I had to navigate it delicately. The instigator's every movement was a cue, and I began mapping responses, preparing to act decisively when the moment demanded it. Then someone from the audience shifted, a subtle murmur rippling through the room. It wasn't a question, nor a challenge, but a gentle signal that aligned with my observations. People were beginning to sense the underlying dynamics, noticing the tension and the silent control emerging. I realized this was a critical inflection point. The earlier betrayal, the act of cutting my microphone, had paradoxically amplified my presence. Now, I could turn the room's energy to my advantage, guiding interactions without speaking louder or forcing authority. I reflected on how often power was misperceived as volume or aggression. True influence was subtler. It relied on understanding, patience, and timing. The room was now a chessboard, each person a piece whose movement could be anticipated and leveraged. The instigator's subtle tests were their attempts to reclaim dominance, but my awareness allowed me to redirect attention and maintain equilibrium. Even in the absence of sound, every glance, every breath carried potential impact. A quiet moment of insight struck me. The disruption had done more than expose the instigator's audacity. It had revealed vulnerabilities in everyone's perception. People now questioned what they thought they knew, paying closer attention to subtle cues. The silence of the microphone had inadvertently become a magnifier of awareness. I knew that the next actions would be decisive. The room's energy had shifted, but only careful, deliberate movements could cement this newfound balance. The instigator, sensing the shift, leaned slightly forward, testing the air again. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but I noticed. I held my position, acknowledging their gesture without flinching, signaling that while they could act, the control had subtly passed. The audience's reactions were telling. Tiny nods, brief exchanges of glances, and the slight straightening of backs indicated that attention was now calibrated differently. Influence was no longer just about audibility or boldness. It was about perception, subtle authority, and the timing of engagement. Transitioning into part 13, I realized the next phase would demand more than patience and observation. The instigator's next move could be unpredictable, and hidden intentions within the room might surface. I had to prepare for both confrontation and subtle manipulations, guiding the room's energy while ensuring my presence remained commanding yet unobtrusive. This balance between observation and strategic intervention would determine the ultimate trajectory of influence and control in the room. The energy in the room had shifted in ways I hadn't anticipated at the outset. What began as a simple disruption, the cut microphone, had cascaded into a subtle battle of perception, influence, and quiet authority. I could feel the instigator's attempts to reclaim control, yet the room's attention had become attuned to nuances rather than volume. Every gesture, glance, and hesitation now mattered, and I moved cautiously, aware that one misstep could reverse the fragile balance I had cultivated. As I observed the room, my mind replayed the earlier moments of betrayal. The act of silencing me had been audacious, almost theatrical, and I understood it for what it was. An assertion of dominance meant to unsettle not just me but the entire audience. Yet paradoxically, it had done the opposite. By attempting to strip me of voice, the instigator had amplified the room's awareness. People had begun listening differently, tuning into subtle cues, and questioning their assumptions. The disruption, though intended as a setback, had unintentionally highlighted my presence in ways a microphone never could. I began noting patterns in behavior, recalling lessons from past confrontations. Silence, I realized, could be more commanding than speech if wielded strategically. As I refrained from reacting immediately, small shifts occurred. The instigator's energy became taut, their confidence tempered by caution, and others in the room mirrored the heightened attentiveness. I recognized that influence was no longer about asserting dominance overtly but about guiding perception, shaping the flow of attention invisibly. The dynamics were delicate, but they were within my grasp. Yet this phase was not without risk. The instigator, aware of their diminishing impact, started introducing subtle provocations, half-statements designed to elicit reactions, questions meant to sow uncertainty. Each test required careful calibration. Responding too quickly would reveal eagerness, but failing to respond could be interpreted as weakness. I understood that the power now lay in timing, in the subtle orchestration of presence and restraint. Observation became my most effective tool, and I measured each move meticulously. The room itself seemed to react organically to this shifting balance. Tiny gestures, a leaning forward, a brief exchange of eye contact, a quiet nod, hinted at emerging alignment, though I couldn't yet be certain of loyalty. Every subtle motion mattered. I reminded myself that authority could be established quietly, not through volume but through awareness and responsiveness. The microphone had been silenced, yet the room's attention now magnified my every subtle signal. I reflected on how betrayal often exposes weaknesses, yet also provides unexpected opportunities. The instigator had assumed the act of cutting my microphone would weaken me, but it had forced the audience to focus on the unseen, the unheard. My advantage lay in knowing that perception could be influenced even without direct speech. Every subtle nod, glance, or shift in posture became a tool for guiding the room's energy. In this environment, influence was a silent force, and patience was the mechanism of power. Tension continued to build as the instigator's testing became more calculated. They began weaving indirect challenges into the room's dialogue, designed to provoke subtle reactions. I resisted the urge to respond immediately, letting the silence and observation speak for me. Each minor interaction revealed a new layer of dynamics. I could sense the audience's shifting attention, aware that some were already sensing the underlying narrative of power and resilience. The disruption had become the catalyst for this emergent awareness, and I could leverage it without needing to confront the instigator directly. A reflective pause in the room gave me insight into the unfolding patterns. As I watched, I realized that influence was as much about anticipation as response. Predicting moves, sensing intentions, and understanding microbehaviors allowed me to navigate the room strategically. The disruption, which initially felt like a setback, had created a moment of opportunity, a chance to guide the energy, subtly shape perception, and turn silence into authority. I could see now that the instigator's attempts at control would only continue to expose weaknesses if handled with patience and observation. By the end of this phase, I felt a quiet confidence emerging. The microphone had been silenced, but I had learned that voice was not always necessary to assert presence. Authority could manifest through awareness, timing, and careful orchestration of subtle cues. The instigator remained, but their energy had shifted. They were no longer fully in control, and the room had begun to recognize the emerging balance. The disruption had created the perfect stage for me to exert influence without confrontation. Looking forward, I understood that the final moments of this unfolding situation would demand careful strategy. Any overt action could either cement authority or provoke backlash. The subtle cues I had observed would inform my decisions in the next phase. Every glance, pause, and unspoken signal carried weight, and the next steps would determine the ultimate outcome. The room was primed, attention finely tuned, and the instigator had no idea how much control had quietly shifted. The disruption had not been the end, it had been the beginning. The tension in the room had become almost tangible, a quiet charge beneath every exchange. I realized that this phase demanded a careful balance. Too much movement, and the instigator might regain dominance. Too little, and the momentum I had built could dissipate. I stayed poised, letting the silence work in my favor, observing how people shifted, leaned, and reacted to each subtle cue. It was a delicate rhythm, one that required both patience and presence, and I understood that the outcome depended on my ability to guide perception rather than force it. Memories of past conflicts surfaced unexpectedly, reminding me how often silence had been underestimated. I had faced challenges before, moments when authority had been questioned, and yet I found that quiet observation often yielded more influence than any confrontation. In this room, after the microphone had been cut, those lessons became relevant once again. Every gesture, pause, and glance carried weight. I realized that the disruption, though initially frustrating, had created a unique opportunity to assert control indirectly, shaping the narrative without words. The instigator, sensing a shift, tried subtle provocations. Half-formed comments and indirect questions were tossed into the conversation, intended to test my resolve and the room's attention. I resisted reacting immediately, aware that an emotional response could betray eagerness. Instead, I focused on observing the micro-responses of the audience, noting who reacted subtly, who shifted in alignment, and who remained uncertain. Influence, I realized, was not imposed. It emerged from perception, timing, and the ability to remain strategically silent. I began tracing patterns in the instigator's behavior, remembering earlier moments when dominance had been asserted through theatrics. The act of cutting the microphone had been designed to disrupt and intimidate, yet here it was revealing a vulnerability I could exploit. By remaining calm, observant, and subtly assertive through posture and measured engagement, I could reclaim authority. Each move became a calculated message, every pause a reinforcement of presence. The room's attention, now finely attuned, began to align subtly with my own energy. Amid this quiet struggle, I reflected on the nature of perception. Authority was not always about speaking loudly or reacting quickly. Sometimes, the most profound control came from the ability to influence attention and expectation. People began to lean in towards subtle cues, slight gestures, micro-expressions, and careful timing. My presence had transformed from reactive to strategic, and the room responded in ways the instigator had not anticipated. The initial act of betrayal had created the perfect stage for this silent influence. As I navigated this phase, I realized the room itself had become a participant in a silent dialogue. Every shift in posture, every glance exchanged, carried meaning. The instigator's attempts to regain control were increasingly predictable, and I began anticipating their moves. By letting them overextend, testing patience and observation, I could guide the audience's perception without overt confrontation. It was a subtle dance, one in which silence, awareness, and strategic timing became my tools. The emotional undercurrents in the room revealed themselves gradually. Some people seemed to admire the composure I maintained, others were quietly questioning the instigator's authority, and a few were caught between loyalty and curiosity. Each minor reaction provided insight into the collective mindset, and I absorbed these cues carefully. The microphone had been cut, but the situation had forced everyone to engage on a different level. More perceptive, more attentive, more aware of the unspoken dynamics. I also reflected privately on how betrayal often illuminates unexpected strengths. The act intended to silence me had inadvertently revealed my capacity for subtle influence. Every challenge, every provocation, became an opportunity to assert presence through observation, timing, and the controlled conveyance of authority. It was no longer about the microphone or its absence. It was about mastering the environment and shaping outcomes indirectly. Gradually, the instigator's energy began to waver. The confidence they had displayed initially now had fissures, cracks visible to anyone observing closely. By staying attuned, patient, and deliberately responsive only when necessary, I turned the room's attention toward a quiet acknowledgement of the shifting balance. The disruption had ceased to be a setback. It had become a tool for establishing authority without confrontation. The room itself was now aligned subtly, and the instigator could feel it. By the end of this phase, I felt a composed awareness of control that went beyond words. The microphone had been silenced, but authority had not been diminished. Instead, it had shifted into a more nuanced, resilient form. I realized that influence and perception often outlast the overt attempts to dominate or disrupt. The stage was set for the final phase, where the balance of power would become evident, and the lessons from this disruption would manifest fully. The room had heard anyway, and in that, I found both resolution and anticipation for what would come next. The air in the room had changed completely. What had started as subtle observation and restrained influence now demanded a decisive moment. I understood that the final act would reveal not only the instigator's limitations but also the quiet resilience I had cultivated throughout the ordeal. Every micro-expression, every subtle reaction I had catalogued over the previous hours converged here. It was no longer enough to remain patient. It was time to assert presence in a way that could no longer be ignored. I stepped forward, letting my body language convey calm authority. Each gesture was deliberate, each pause strategically placed, reflecting control without overt force. The room was attuned. I could feel it in the collective gaze, the way people leaned slightly forward, unconsciously aligning with the tension I projected. The microphone had been silenced, yes, but my voice, my intent, remained unmistakable. I realized that authority is often most potent when it doesn't rely on technology or amplification, but on presence, timing, and clarity of intent. The instigator tried a last-ditch effort, a sudden assertion meant to reclaim dominance. I anticipated it, allowed a brief moment for them to overreach, and then countered not with confrontation, but with quiet confidence. The room reacted immediately. Subtle nods, shifts in posture, a collective acknowledgement that the dynamic had shifted irrevocably. This was poetic in a way. The act meant to undermine me had highlighted my capacity for resilience and control, and those observing recognized it instinctively. I reflected internally on how often moments of betrayal create opportunities for deeper revelation. The cutting of the microphone had been designed to embarrass, intimidate, and assert authority, yet it revealed my ability to influence without relying on conventional tools. The room had witnessed this transformation, whether consciously or not. My presence, unshaken and strategic, became a lens through which the audience reevaluated the instigator's power and mine. Time felt stretched. Every second of observation became loaded with meaning. The instigator's attempts to provoke were increasingly transparent, predictable even. I did not react overtly but allowed small, calculated gestures. A nod here, a measured glance there, to communicate assurance and maintain momentum. In this subtle interplay, the room itself became a participant, reinforcing my authority silently yet powerfully. As the moments unfolded, the tension in the room began to dissolve, replaced by a quiet respect that had not existed at the start. The instigator's energy, once dominating and aggressive, now felt unsteady, as if their overreach had inadvertently validated my presence. It was a delicate reversal, one achieved without harsh confrontation but through patience, observation, and strategic engagement. I realized that the lesson here extended beyond this room. Influence is not always a matter of volume or aggression. Often it is the quiet, persistent assertion of presence and intent that shapes outcomes. People began to lean in closer, some exchanging glances of acknowledgement, others subtly aligning with the rhythm I set. The room itself had become a vessel for silent consensus. I felt a subtle relief, a sense of closure that arose not from triumphalism but from mastery over the situation and an understanding of the dynamics at play. The microphone had been cut, yet the essence of communication had transcended its absence. Authority, I recognized, could not be silenced when it resided in presence and strategic awareness. The instigator, recognizing the shift, hesitated. The overconfidence that had marked the beginning now gave way to doubt. I remained poised, maintaining the quiet rhythm, the calm awareness that had carried me through every challenge. The room's energy subtly shifted to support the balance I had established. It was not domination, but a quiet alignment, a testament to endurance, observation, and strategic restraint. Reflecting on the experience, I realized that this ordeal had been less about confrontation and more about discovery. The act of cutting the microphone was a catalyst, forcing me to explore new methods of influence and communication. The audience had seen this transformation unfold, even as the instigator had underestimated it. The silence, the disruption, and the tension all converged into a singular lesson. Resilience, presence, and clarity of intent outweigh theatrics and aggressive assertions of control. By the final moments, the room's energy confirmed the outcome without a single raised voice. The instigator had been neutralized, not through conflict, but through the quiet assertion of strategic authority. I understood the subtle power of patience, awareness, and the ability to let others reveal themselves. In that moment, the experience of betrayal, disruption, and challenge transformed into insight, mastery, and the satisfaction of an unspoken triumph. The microphone had been cut, yet the room had heard anyway. And in that realization, a sense of closure emerged, not just for the events in the room, but for my own understanding of influence, resilience, and the dynamics of human attention. The story had reached its conclusion, yet the lessons would echo far beyond this moment, reminding me that power is not measured by volume, but by presence, clarity, and the quiet endurance that shapes perception and outcome. As I step back and look at what just unfolded, I realize how fragile trust can be, even between those we call family. It's not just about a microphone being cut or words being silenced. It's about feeling heard when the world tries to ignore you. Every betrayal left a mark, but also a lesson in resilience. Standing there, knowing the room heard me anyway, I felt a quiet dignity settle in. A reminder that even when others try to mute you, your truth cannot be erased. Empowerment doesn't come from revenge or confrontation. It comes from reclaiming your voice, holding your boundaries, and proving that integrity can survive even the sharpest betrayals. Life may hand us unexpected challenges, but it's in these moments of quiet assertion that our strength is revealed. If you've ever felt powerless when someone close overstepped boundaries, you'll want to see what happened next when I faced a different kind of betrayal within my own home. The story takes a twist that tests every ounce of patience and courage, and shows how far someone will go to regain control. Don't miss this unfolding journey of resilience, dignity, and quiet victory. Click to follow along and witness the next chapter of standing strong when trust is broken.